Last year was one of the most dangerous years for law enforcement in recent history due to the increase of violence directed towards law enforcement officers. In 2021, 346 officers were shot in the line of duty, 63 of whom were killed by gunfire. This includes 133 officers who were shot in 107 ambush-style attacks, an increase of 115% from 2020. 32 of those officers in ambush attacks were killed. Despite all of this, coupled with the nationwide crime crisis fueled by rogue prosecutors and the COVID-19 pandemic, the brave men and women of law enforcement continue to hold the line. They work tirelessly to protect the communities that they serve. They stood between good and evil. Today we're joined by Tim Richardson and Mark McDonald of the National Fraternal Order of Police Government and Media Affairs Center in Washington, D.C. to discuss the recent release of the 2021 Officers Shot in the Line of Duty and Killed report. We'll dive into how this data is collected and the trends we're seeing across the country. I'm Patrick Yoes, National President of Fraternal Order Police, and this is the Blue View. Well, gentlemen, thank you for joining us on a Blue View. First, before we even get started, let me just say that this last year and a half, 2 years, has been a very challenging time for us in law enforcement. And our legislative office has all hands on deck, has really made a huge impact in the quality of lives of our members. So I want to thank each one of you. Tim, let's start with you. What would you tell our? You've been around a long time, the FOP, but I'm not too sure how many of them actually see the person behind all the work we do here in DC. So why don't you tell our listeners and our viewers a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having us on. I certainly appreciate all the opportunities I've had here with the Fraternal Order Police. I started as a much younger man in June 96. So that means I'm on my 27th year with the organization. Right. And it's, I'm very proud of the work that we have done here. And I appreciate your leadership and everything that the FOP has accomplished for our men and women in the field.
A little bit about your background.
Sure. I grew up in southern New Jersey, went to school in central Pennsylvania, came down here to DC as one does, was interned for a while with the U.S. Senate. And then this turned out to be my first real job in DC.
Well, good. We're glad to have you. Great work you do. Mark, how about you?
Absolutely. Well, Pat, thanks for having us on. I've been with the FOP for about three and a half years. Prior to working for the FOP, I was on the Hill working for a member of Congress from Pennsylvania. And in between, that was my first job out of school. I went to Goucher College up in Baltimore. But in between those two jobs, I was kind of doing some political work here and there. And after a campaign in 2018, I saw a job open up at the FOP. I had to apply, and Tim accepted my application, and 3.5 years later, here we are.
Well, great, and we appreciate you too. And for those of you who do watch the Blue View, and have watched it over the last since February when we started it, Mark is the guy behind the cameras that makes it all happen. So, Mark, thank you as well. So, guys, we're going to talk about a travesty, the violence on law enforcement officers, and how we came about collecting this data, working with the Blue Alert grant from the Department of Justice. And Tim, I'd like you to just walk us through a little bit of this process of receiving a grant, what we did to get it, and what it's telling us.
Sure. Well, our work actually does predate the grant that we received. In 2015, we were witnessing something new in law enforcement, a trend where officers were being targeted, and they were being targeted because their assailants did not like law enforcement, had espoused political or social views that were against law enforcement. So we began to develop legislation that eventually turned into the Protect and Serve Act that would make targeting law enforcement officers a federal crime, a federal offense in certain jurisdictions. In order to make the case on the Hill and with the administration, we began to collect data on officers who were shot but not killed. It was, very much a in-house operation. We collected data through the end of 2016. In 2016, there was an enormous spike on officers shot and killed by ambush. 64 officers killed by gunfire in 2016, one of the highest numbers that we'd ever experienced. And a number of those were from ambushes. So we developed this legislation and basically began collecting this data as evidence to support it. We were the only game in town. We were the only ones who were collecting and tracking this information. Nobody else was doing it. So when we began to share that with the administration, with the Hill, the Blue Alert folks who work out of the COPS office, they were very intrigued, and they actually started to collect it themselves in 2018, and then came to the realization, hey, why don't we make this a grant and partner with the FOP, because we're just copying and overlapping one another's work. So in the fall of 2019, we earned the grant, and as of that spring, we did the handoff, and we have been collecting it and sharing it on a regular basis since then.
Right, and prior to the grant, Mark, you played a big part in collecting this data. I want you to talk a little bit about what that data was when we initially started doing it, and what was the story it was telling us.
Prior to the grant, we were really just trying to track officers shot and killed, going off of news reports that we would find on Google or social media or whatnot. And the data that we were collecting was really basic: state, agency, number of officers shot and or killed. But post receiving the Blue Alert grant, we've been able to enhance our efforts, collect more data and more thorough data from a wider range of sources. Research tool that we use tracks or searches through over 300,000 news reporting agencies from all over the country, national, state, local. And we began looking more in depth as to time, type of incident, the status of the offender, whether they were captured or were able to get away. And it really led us to a rude awakening when we began to look at the data as to the number of officers that were found themselves in ambush style attacks. Prior to receiving the grant, we weren't really looking at that. We didn't know that it was really even possible to begin tracking that data. But whenever you see a story like that, it does catch your eye. But as we found, it happens, more frequent than we would think.
It's interesting. The federal government through FBI index crimes. There's a lot of data that's collected in law enforcement, but it's surprising. Even in law enforcement officers' deaths, but it's surprising to know that there never really was a source to go to determine just how many attempts are made. We know how many law enforcement officers are killed. What we don't know is how many times they try to kill law enforcement officers.
That too, but the one thing that we're unable to track is the number of officers that are shot at.
Right.
I think I can't recall the exact number of officers shot in Chicago last year, but I saw a report within the last month or so that said 70 or 73 officers were either shot at or shot. Yeah. So all of those instances we're not even being able to track.
Right. And speaking of if you've really these concerning trends, let's look at 2021. As we started this episode, we talked about 2021 being a very deadly year for law enforcement and such a rise in not only law enforcement officers' deaths, but also those ambush attacks. Tim, can you kind of compare that report to maybe some previous years of what we saw last year and what some of the factors are for it?
Sure. I think it's, analogous to an overall crime spike, and the attitude toward law enforcement hasn't really changed. And no one's really looked at it, in detail. One of the reasons we began collecting this data was, as I mentioned, to build a case for the bill, but in being able to expand and get more information about the incidents, we're also learning more about what's driving them. And it really is an animus toward law enforcement officers. It's they don't have the support that they once enjoyed because it was, eroded by events in 2020. And of course, I think the pandemic and the lockdown contributed to it too. And the increase in rhetoric. I mean, we've seen it over and over again. When you allow unchallenged, hateful speech, rhetoric that's aimed to incite violence, it does, and violence ensues.
Yeah, and I got to think that social media, the anonymity of social media, allows people to express their views, and in doing so, kind of builds a community around their own belief systems and validates them to some extent. So it's probably pretty complex, a number of factors that do it. But the one thing that's very clear is it is very dangerous to be a law enforcement officer in today's environment.
Sure.
And that's a message. So, you talked about the Protect or Serve Act. in getting this data. Before it was just anecdotal. We knew that it was a problem. We just didn't have any quantitative data to be able to show that there's some trends here. So how has that helped with the Protect and Serve Act? I know it's something that we're still pushing and hoping to get Congress to move with, but talk a little bit about the status of that bill and how this information has helped us really grow some recognition for the bill and the need for a bill.
Sure. Well, I should first start by noting that penalties for attacking a law enforcement officer, whether or not they succeed at killing the officer, are very stiff in all 50 states. However, just as we have done with other hate-oriented crimes, you want to throw a national spotlight on it. You want to highlight that danger is out there and that society's attitudes toward law enforcement were driving this violence against them. And this data has helped us establish that. So when you have when Congress takes action, you shine a spotlight on that. But really, what we're not trying to do is just pass a federal law. I don't think that authority would be exercised very often because the penalties in the state are pretty stiff for these types of crimes. However, it would, we hope, change the national consciousness with respect to how law enforcement officers are viewed by some parts of the population, and amplified by the social media packs and circles that you mentioned, and kind of change the way that we think and feel about our law enforcement officers who are out there in the line of fire to protect us every day. So that's really, the main goal of the legislation, less so to pass a law, more so to get the nation and kind of take them by the collar and say, hey, guys, this is a real problem out there. And
what's the status of that bill now in this Congress?
In this Congress, it has stalled in both chambers. We have about 27 co-sponsors in the Senate, and right around 100, I think, in the House. Now, just 4 years ago, in 2018, it passed the Judiciary Committee unanimously, and it passed the House 385 to 32, I believe, was the final vote. So I think the support is out there. It's just been drowned out by other events.
Yeah, and definitely some strange times we're in. So we track this data on officers shot and the violence towards law enforcement officers. And again, the ambush attacks are a telling story in themselves. And are you familiar with the FBI's report of ambush attacks a while back? Can you talk about the trend of what you're seeing, what was found in the FBI report, and what we think this data is telling us now, at least on ambush attacks?
Sure. Well, the FBI analyzed 50 different assailants from 2016 and a handful from 2017. What they found, the common features were that these attacks, 28% of the ambushes were driven by individuals who desired to harm a law enforcement officer. That was their motivation. The other commonality is 86% had prior criminal records, and that was the secondary motivating factor on a lot of those ambush attacks. They did not want to go back to jail. They did not want to go and lose their freedom, and that escalates those incidents very quickly. And also, of course, you had the social unrest at the time. You had the mass murders of officers in Dallas and Baton Rouge, which were all politically motivated. Right. So what this is telling us is that the problem out there is going unaddressed. We're not reaching the folks that we need to reach in the communities who are aware of this animus and might take actions to stop it or mitigate it.
Yeah, so these tools that allow us to track this data has been very beneficial for us to be able to track some additional data. If we look back just 2 years ago, I don't think anybody could have envisioned how much the world would change because of COVID. And everyone was encouraged to stop the spread, to stay home and just isolate themselves. But law enforcement officers and public safety, for that matter, showed up every single day. And continued to do the jobs that they do, protecting their communities. And we knew early on that law enforcement and public safety would be exposed at a higher rate than normal. And Mark, I know we use the same tools to be able to track COVID deaths. Can you kind of walk us through that process and tell us what the data has told us over the last 2 years?
Absolutely. So in the beginning of COVID, within the first week of lockdown, I remember getting a call from you. talking about how you wanted to begin tracking some of the COVID deaths. We had no idea the level that we reached 2 years later. But we began to use the same methods and resources we had for tracking officers shot and killed to track COVID deaths. And the problem with the COVID deaths were that, we would have to look through obituaries, news reporting, press releases, and social media, because everything happened so quickly. When an officer dies in the line of duty, it's covered by the local news or the regional news. But when everything was happening so quickly, it was really hard to find that information. So again, using those tools, we were able to search and comb through all of that. And 2.5 years later, we just hit 1,000. We're about 1,006 COVID line of duty deaths. We were able to use that data to really push for the presumption as well, the PSOB presumption.
Talk a little bit about the presumption.
We were able to use the data we were collecting to push for the presumption. If an officer died in the line of duty or became disabled, and they were working within the time from, Tim, what was it?
January 1, 2019, I think.
Yeah, through, we got it extended, of course, through the end of this year. But if the officer was working during that time period and they did contract COVID and become disabled or die from COVID-19, it's presumed that they contracted the disease in the line of duty. Because at the beginning, again, we didn't know how long it took to infect you or make you ill. We didn't know the long-term consequences of it as well. And again, using that data, we were able to get this presumption because our guys were still going to work every single day. They weren't able to stay home.
Tim, prior to this presumptive rule, initially came out from Attorney General Barr, and then it was codified by Congress later on in that year. Prior to that, in order to be eligible for PSOB benefits, public safety survivor benefits for the family, you had to be able to make that connection on how you contracted it. And COVID was a little different. It was really hard to determine, it could be any number of factors. So what's the criteria in order to be eligible for PSOB benefits?
Sure. The Public Safety Officers Benefits Program is one that benefits surviving families or officers who are seriously injured and are disabled as a result. It does cover, work contracted illnesses, but you have to identify what incident it was. And that was built in the days where HIV and AIDS were ravaging, particularly correctional staff. I was exposed to an inmate. He bled on me. I was handling an inmate who vomited on me, and you could connect that incident with contracting the disease. With COVID, you were, rolling the dice and playing the lottery every day that our men and women went there. We didn't know if it lived on surface areas. We didn't know fully how it spread. So we went to the Justice Department because we recognized this, as you mentioned, we were, our men and women were going to be in the soup the whole time. They were not, social distancing in their jobs. It's impossible. So we went to Attorney General Barr, and, he very quickly grasped the situation and directed the department to the extent that he could under the existing statute, give every benefit of the doubt to surviving family members or to injured officers. And that was step one. We did that, I think, in very early April of 2020. And then we worked with Congress, with both parties. This was not a partisan outfit, to change the PSOB law so that there was a presumption. If a public safety officer contracted COVID-19, unless the department could demonstrate conclusively that the exposure was not related to their work, which is, a very, very high bar to meet, they were going to be presumed to have contracted it in the line of duty. And that's really the key. That program is so important for survivor families. And we had the benefit of having a very pro law enforcement attorney general in Mr. Barr, and a Congress that was willing to change the law and do it quickly. I think it was passed by the end of May of that year.
Yeah. It went pretty quick. And Mark, I know one extra step that we took here, regardless of whether they were members of the FOP or not, every person we identified that potentially would fall into that 1,007, all receive correspondence from us, the families, or to agencies, kind of expressing the steps need to be taken to see if they were eligible for PSOB. Can you talk a little bit about the steps that we took in order to be able to inform agencies of the possibility of this benefit?
In the beginning, when we were sending letters out, we would send a letter out to each agency that lost an officer. If it came across our desk that this officer passed from COVID, but we weren't able to verify it because it was a social media report. We tried to collect as many sources as possible, and we then sent a letter to the agency with PSOB information. Because again, in the beginning, even after the presumption, a lot of agencies, sheriffs, police chiefs, they didn't know what has been updated or the process to get the family benefits. So the information that we sent them really allowed them to help the families following the line of duty death. And again, we're still sending them today. In 2 years after, we're still sending them because we come across an incident where the officer does die from COVID.
And if there's any silver lining to any of this, it's that we're sending far less of those letters today than we were at a time when we were probably sending 40, 50 a week, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's really tapered off. So it's an indication that we're on the other side of this. And so I appreciate all the work that both of you have done. I'll let you, Tim, we'll start with you. Any final thoughts as we wrap this up?
Sure. I think the importance of tracking this data and that the FOP chose to do so and share it with with our partners on the Hill and within the administration. It has value because for shot and killed, we learn more about incidents where officers are placed in danger. That's going to augment their training. We can identify when ambush attacks are going to be more prevalent. And that is going to, in a very real way, impact training and make officers hopefully more safe when they encounter these situations, even if it's just greater vigilance when they're out on the street. And with the COVID information, all this data was collected to support legislative ends. So I think it has a real value other than just numbers on a page. It makes a difference.
Mark, any final thoughts?
You mentioned it previously. You mentioned it a little bit ago. These numbers are real people with real families. Myself, my colleague Matt Brown here, we come through all this information daily. And when you look at the final report on officers shot and killed or the COVID deaths, it's easy to just see the numbers, but for us, this is definitely one of the harder projects that I work on, because I read about the families, I read about the incidents, I read about the colleagues, the words that they have to say about their fallen brother or sister. We publish end of watches on our social media pages to honor the fallen, and you put names with faces, and it's just a reminder that these guys and gals go out every day, to serve and protect their communities.
And you're right. I do really appreciate the fact that you're right. This is not just names. This is just not just numbers. And that's one thing that I really like about our social media approach of calling attention to this is that every one of these officers, once we confirm that it's COVID or line of duty death, we're posting it for the world to see who they are and that they're not just a number. They're real people and leave families behind. Mark, you mentioned on our social media, so I'll let you kind of give a plug for resources that are available through the FOP. If somebody wants to follow us and keep track of this information, what's the best way for them to go about it?
So they could definitely check out our social media pages. Everything that we produce, all of our resources, we'll tend to push out on our social media at GLFOP for Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. On Instagram at FOP National. But FOP.net, it has all of the information for our resources, whether it be legislative or officer shot and killed. FOPcovid19.org has all of our COVID line of duty deaths and resources and whatnot.
Well, guys, thank you. Thank you for, again, not only joining us here today, but all that you do. This, like I said, this has been a very unusual 2 years for us. And there's a lot of work that's come out of our legislative office trying to stay ahead of all of the different challenges that we had. And I cannot be prouder of the staff that we have here and all that you've done. Jim and any other the folks working here as well have done a great job. And to our viewers, I want to thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Blue View, where we talk about the issues that are vitally important to men and women who suit up and show up in communities all across this country every single day. Thank you.
Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. To get the latest from the National FOP, make sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at GLFOP and on Instagram at FOP National. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.